People ask me sometimes how I ended up making the journey twice. The first time, I tell them, was the job. The second time was something else, and I have not always known what to call it. I have settled, over the years, on calling it the same thing, the job, because it was, and because the distinction between the job done correctly and the job done with more than is strictly required has always seemed to me like a distinction that collapses under examination. If you can see what needs doing and you do not do it, that is a failure of the job regardless of whether it falls inside the written specifications. But I will start at the beginning, which is the first time, because the second time does not make sense without it. I have been a transit inspector for the Compact's Outer Settlements Authority for 22 years. The work is not glamorous, and it does not pretend to be. It is the work of traveling to places the administrative infrastructure has not quite reached yet, and making sure that the documents produced in those places are produced correctly, so that when someone somewhere needs to rely on them, they hold. The outer settlements attract people who are, by selection, the kind of people who prefer to be 9 days from the nearest administrative center. They are not uniformly easy people. They are, however, almost uniformly people who mean what they put on paper, because out on the corridor spurs there is no one to argue with afterward if the paper is wrong. This is, in my opinion, the most important quality a person can have with respect to documentation, and I have spent 22 years working in places where it is the default rather than the exception. It has given me a particular impatience with the inner system's approach to paperwork, which is to say the approach that treats documentation as a performance of compliance rather than a factual record of reality. A form filled incorrectly is not documentation. It is a liability waiting to be discovered by whoever has an interest in discovering it. I have spent 22 years making sure the forms in the outer settlements are filled correctly, because the outer settlements cannot afford the alternative. My territory covers the Kes, Orvath, and Lower Veth corridor networks, roughly 400 registered stations and outposts at varying levels of administrative development, from full transit hubs with their own legal staff to single-operator relay posts, where the only official document anyone has filed in the past year is the monthly operational status report. I travel an average of 300 days out of each year. I have seen 2 births in the field prior to the one at Station 9, both under emergency conditions where the inspector happened to be present. This was not an emergency. This was a man who had planned a birth registration with the same methodical attention he brought to antenna array maintenance schedules, and who had contacted my office 90 days in advance to explain precisely what he needed and why, and whose initial inquiry had been so thoroughly reasoned that my supervisor had forwarded it to me with a single annotation. This one is yours. I had agreed. When an outer settlements operator contacts the Civil Registry Authority with a request that demonstrates they have already read the applicable sections and are asking because they want the job done right rather than because they are confused, that is the work at its best. I had filed my route addendum, planned the journey, and reread the birth registration provisions on the 4-day trip out, not because I needed to, but because the man I was going to had read them too, and I wanted to be able to discuss them on the same level. But I will return to Kes Corridor Station 9. The station sat at the outer edge of the Kes corridor on a basalt shelf above a cold valley, with an antenna array on the roof that was taller than the building itself, and a view of the gas giant Kes primary from the north window that was, I was told, genuinely spectacular at certain angles of the moon's orbit. I was there in the early part of the corridor winter, and the view from the north window when I arrived was a low gray sky and the first suggestion of snow in the upper air, and the gas giant a pale disk behind the weather layer, visible but not spectacular. The building itself was modest. 2 main rooms, a workshop attached at the east side, and the relay equipment distributed across all 3 spaces in the pragmatic way of single-operator stations, where the equipment goes where it fits and aesthetics are not a consideration. Torren Saul was the most organized human being I have ever met in 22 years of this work, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I do not mean tidy. The relay post was not tidy. It was the workspace of a single person managing a high-maintenance technical installation, and it had the organized chaos of such places, tools in specific locations that made sense to the person who had put them there, and to no one else. Maintenance logs stacked in a sequence that was chronological from the bottom and thematic from the top. The spare components for the antenna array sorted by replacement frequency rather than by part category. And a wall of written notations beside the East Relay panel that constituted the station's institutional memory, in a format that was entirely legible once you understood that it had been written not for any visitor but for himself, in the past, for himself in the future, who might be tired or distracted or working in poor light, and needed the information in the fastest possible form. What I mean by organized is that, when I arrived, after 4 days of travel through the outer transit routes in a borrowed inspection shuttle with a heater that worked on alternate hours, he had the documentation ready. Not mostly ready, not nearly ready, ready. Every form filled in the correct sequence, every signature space marked with a notation of who needed to sign it, and in what capacity. A handwritten index on the front cover of the folder listing every document inside with its page reference and its purpose in plain language, as though he had expected me to need to explain the package to someone who had never seen a civil registry birth filing and wanted to make sure I could do it without confusion. I sat down at his table, the only table, the one that served for meals and maintenance planning and administrative work, and apparently also for the careful assembly of civil registry documentation packages, and I opened the folder and read through it, and then I read through it again. Because the first time I was looking for gaps, and the second time I was looking to understand how someone 9 days from any administrative center had produced a more complete civil registry package than I had seen from fully staffed offices in the inner settlements. "You've done this before," I said. "No," he said. He was making tea. He had made tea when I arrived and offered it without ceremony, which is the correct approach for someone greeting an inspector who has been traveling for 4 days and has opinions about refreshment. I read the code. "Which sections?" He listed them, 7 sections in order, with the relevant subsections cited accurately from memory. I knew they were accurate because I had reviewed the same sections during the 4-day journey. "When did you read them?" I said. "When she told me she was pregnant." He poured the tea and set a cup in front of me. I wanted to know what needed to be right before I could say everything was going to be right, so I read until I knew. I drank the tea. It was good, a Prester blend from a Vithrani trade shop several corridor stops back, the kind that is expensive by outer settlement standards and worth it. He had apparently had it on hand for the visit, because the tin was newly opened. "Tell me about the mother," I said. He looked at me with the mild attention of a man who had been expecting this question and had thought about how to answer it. "What do you need to know?" "Everything you want the record to contain," I said. "The formal information is in the folder. I want the context." He considered this for a moment. Then he told me about her in the way you describe someone you have been paying close attention to for years, not poetically, not performatively, but precisely. The technical qualifications of someone who had learned to run the East array calibration in adverse weather within 18 months of arriving at the post, which was a skill it had taken him 3 years to develop because he had learned it without anyone to show him, and she had the advantage of someone to show her, and she had taken the advantage seriously. The administrative competence of someone who had read the compact's outer settlements, welfare provisions well enough to catch a drafting ambiguity in a form he had been filling in wrong for 4 years, and had corrected it without making anything of the correction. The fact that she could replace the thermal coupling on the secondary antenna mount faster than he could because she had noticed, early on, that the mounting bracket had been installed 3 degrees off alignment at manufacture, and had shimmed it herself, so that the coupling seated cleanly instead of requiring the controlled force he had been applying for years. He said all of this in the same flat, direct tone, and all of it was the kind of information that belongs in a professional assessment, and none of it was the most important thing he was telling me. The most important thing he was telling me was in what he chose to observe, which was competence, not sentiment, not history, not longing, but what she could do and what she had chosen to do and how she had done it. He described her the way he described his station, as something he had learned to read correctly and which rewarded careful reading. "How long has she been at the post?" I said. 7 years, he said, since year 2 of her absence from Veth. "Has she expressed any intention to return?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitant thinking, which is different and which I had already identified as his characteristic mode of response to questions that mattered. "She's going to have to," he said. "We both know it. There are things that belong to her there that she hasn't dealt with yet. They're still hers whether she deals with them or not, but dealing with them requires going there, and she'll go when she's ready." He set down his tea. "Until then, this is where she is. And Davin will be where she is. The child's name is already decided." "Davin," he said, "her grandmother's name adapted. In the compact romanization it's the same letters either way." He looked at the folder on the table. "I put it in the registration form in the first draft. She approved it. It's been in there for 3 months." The princess was present for the formal interview portion of the registration. I had expected her to be reserved in the way that people of house significance sometimes are with official processes, not obstructive, but contained, weighing each word before it left. She was not contained. She answered every question directly, gave her full Veth designation without abbreviation, and spelled the house identifier in both the Vethrani script and the compact romanization when I asked her to confirm it for the record, which she did from memory and without hesitation. She had the particular quality of someone who had spent years somewhere that rewarded precision over performance. 7 years at this post, I thought. 7 years in which every calibration reading either was or was not correct, every maintenance log entry either did or did not match the actual state of the equipment, every form either was or was not filled in the column where it belonged. The post did not reward people who treated documentation as performance. It rewarded people who filled in the correct column, because the correct column was where the information lived, and you needed to find it later. When I asked her to confirm the father's name and registry number, she gave the 7 digits in the same flat tone he used for maintenance logs, and the ease of it told me that she had committed that number to memory not recently but some time ago, at a point when it had become information that belonged to her permanently. The kind of information you memorize not to demonstrate that you have done so, but because it is true, and you want to be able to say it accurately when you need to. "The file at the palace," I said. "Are you aware of its status?" "My mother sent a message in year 6, she said. She said the file was still open. She was telling me I had time." She looked at the folder between us. "I am going back when this is ready. I wasn't going to go back with something that wasn't ready. The morn at the palace he kept his end. I needed to keep mine." "The file has been kept correctly," I said, "on that end." "I know." Something in her expression was quiet and certain, the quality of someone who has been holding a calculation for years and has now received the last variable. "I am going back when this is ready." I noted this in the interview record. Then I moved on to the next section of the form, and she answered the next question, and the interview was conducted correctly and documented fully, and the folder contained everything it needed to contain. It took an hour. She did not hurry it, and she did not make it longer than it needed to be. And at the end, she read the completed form before she signed it. All of it. in the way that people sign things when the signature is their word and not a courtesy gesture. The child was born on a Thursday. I was still at the post. The registration requires the inspector to remain through the birth for confirmation of live delivery, which is a provision that was written for frontier settlements where medical documentation is otherwise unavailable, and which Torren Saul had cited specifically in his initial inquiry as the reason he needed an in-person inspection visit rather than a remote certification process. He had cited it correctly. He had read that section too. The post's medical kit was better stocked than most frontier outposts I had visited. There was a reason for this that I did not investigate, but which I suspected had to do with 7 years of gradual preparation by someone who reads the applicable sections before he says everything is going to be right. The supplies were organized on the medical shelf in the same system as everything else by use frequency, with the most likely needed items at the front and the less likely items behind, and a written inventory on the inside of the shelf door listing what was there and when each item needed to be replaced. The expiry dates had been tracked. Nothing was expired. There was a moment in the early hours of Thursday morning when I held a lamp steady over the workspace while he assisted and she worked, and the lamp was not quite enough light at the angle I had it, and I had to shift it to a precise position and hold it there for 2 hours. My arm ached for 4 days afterward. I did not say anything about it because holding the lamp correctly is not something that requires comment. The work in front of us required the light where it was needed, and so I held the lamp where it was needed, and that was all there was to it. The child arrived at 3:17. He announced himself immediately and comprehensively, which I noted in the delivery record as live birth, 3:17, vigorous, all observable indicators normal. Torren Saul held his son for approximately 45 seconds. During those 45 seconds, he stood very still and looked at the child with the expression of a person reading a document they have been waiting to read for a long time and finding that it says exactly what they had hoped it said. He said nothing. Then he said, quietly, Davin, which I understood was a confirmation more than a greeting, the name settling onto the person it belonged to, becoming true in the room, the way things become true when someone says them plainly and means them entirely. Then he gave the child to his mother, and the child quieted in the way newborns do when they find what they were looking for, and the room was still for a moment in the particular way that rooms are still when something irreversible and good has just happened. I set down the lamp and stretched my arm carefully and did not say anything about it. In the quiet after, while the princess settled and the child found his first sleep, Torren Saul went to the comm station and sent a message. I saw him do it from across the room. I did not ask what it said because it was not my business and I did not need to know. Later, after the registration was complete and I was reviewing the documentation, he told me without being asked. He had sent a message to the Palace Records office, a brief one. It said, live birth, 3:17, male, Torren Saul Veth, all well. Registration proceeding as planned. He had sent it before the sun came up on Kesprimary's shadow, before the coffee was made, before anything else, because the record at the palace was part of the record, and the record needed to know. He had gotten a reply within the hour. It said from the head of domestic records, received and noted, file updated, well done. He showed me the reply without comment. I read it and nodded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the two messages had not already said between them, which was that two people on opposite ends of 9 days of corridor travel were doing the same work from different desks, and the work was holding. I completed the documentation by 600. I initialed every page, stamped the official seal, entered the compact civil registry confirmation number, and filed a digital copy with the Outer Settlements Registry database from the Post's comm system. The physical copies I sealed in the bark leather document case that Torren Saul had prepared for the purpose. It was exactly the right size, waterproofed on the outside, with a closure mechanism that would not fail in corridor weather. He had prepared it before my arrival, in advance of a birth that had not yet happened, because the documents would need to travel after, and he had thought about what they would need for the journey. I left on Saturday morning. The heater in my inspection shuttle had been repaired overnight. Torren Saul had gone out after supper on Friday and worked on it for an hour and come back in with grease on his hands and said, flatly, that the heater relay had been misaligned and he had corrected it. He had not asked whether I wanted him to. He had simply seen what needed doing. The heater worked on every hour of the return journey, and the 4 days back through the outer Kess corridor were not warm, but they were tolerable, which was more than they had been on the way out. That was the first visit. The second visit was 6 months later. It was not scheduled. It happened because I was in the corridor on a routine inspection run that took me through the outer Kess transit nodes, and the outer Kess transit nodes were 9 days from the relay post, but only 4 days from my transit route at the point of closest approach, and I had a reason to make the detour. The reason was a document that had crossed my desk 6 weeks after the first visit, sent from an administrative office that I will describe only as being affiliated with interests that had reasons to prefer the registration had not gone correctly. The document was a challenge to the birth registration on the grounds of a technical ambiguity in the Compact Civil Registry Code. Specifically, a provision regarding the witnessing authority of inspectors acting outside their formally designated corridor assignments. The argument was that the outer Kess settlements were not within my formal assignment territory, and that my witnessing signature therefore carried uncertain authority, and that the registration should be suspended pending a determination of its validity. It was a careful argument. The provision existed. The corridor assignment boundaries were genuinely imprecise at the outer edges of the Kess network, a drafting artifact from when the corridor had been extended in stages, and the boundary definitions had not been updated to reflect the full extent of the later additions. Someone had read the code carefully enough to find this gap, and had moved on it within 6 weeks of the registration being filed. That timing told me something about the nature of the operation. A faction that had a flag on the Veth Civil Registry, just as Torren Saul had a flag on the birth registration case number, watching for activity and ready to move when it appeared. I read the challenge 3 times. Then I read the relevant code sections, which I knew well but wanted to reread with the specific argument in front of me. I found what I was looking for in the 4th subsection of the provision they had cited, a qualifier that the challenging party had either missed or judged unlikely to be cited. And in 2 additional provisions they had not cited at all, and in the Compact's own precedent record for the application of the corridor assignment rules in civil registry contexts. That precedent record covered 9 cases over the previous decade and uniformly supported a broader reading of inspector authority than the challenge was asserting. In 3 of those 9 cases, the inspector had been operating at a greater distance from their formal assignment territory than I had been at Station 9. The answer existed. The question was whether to submit it by correspondence or to go back. I thought about it for several days. A written response would be adequate. A written response would probably prevail. But adequate and probably are not the same as complete and certainly, and I had put my name on that registration, and I had been present at 3:17, and I had held a lamp at a precise angle for 2 hours, and the record was right, and I was not willing to let it remain uncertain because of a drafting artifact in the corridor boundary definitions. If someone had built a challenge around that artifact, they would look for the next one afterward. The supplementary statement would close not just the current challenge but the space around it. I looked at my transit calendar, found the corridor run, and filed the route addendum. My office confirmed it without further comment. I spent the 4-day journey reviewing the challenge and the applicable provisions, and preparing the outline of the supplementary statement in my working notes, so that when I arrived I would be ready to write it quickly rather than using time at the post that could be better spent on other things. When I arrived, the post looked the same, which is what posts look like when the person running them is doing the work correctly. The antenna array on the roof was straight. The approach path was clear. The light in the north window was on, which meant someone was working, which was always the case here because the work did not stop. Inside, Torren Saul was at the main table with the child in the crook of his left arm and the maintenance log open under his right hand, making notations with the flat attention of someone doing two things simultaneously, because both things needed doing, and there was no reason they couldn't happen at the same time. The child was asleep against his shoulder. The child was 4 months old now and had apparently developed opinions about sleeping, which were that it should happen wherever he happened to be, against whatever solid surface was available, with his face turned toward the warmth. He looked up when I came in and said, "Inspector Vale," in the tone of someone who had been expecting me eventually and was not surprised by the timing. "The documentation challenge," I said. "I saw it," he said. "I have a flag on the civil registry case number, sends me a notification when any activity is filed. I set it up the day after you left." He looked down at the maintenance log, made a final notation, and set the pen down. "I have the response prepared." Of course he did. It was on the table in a folder, thinner than the first, but the same format, with the handwritten index on the front cover listing 3 documents with their page references and purposes in plain language. I sat down and opened it. The first document was a formal request submitted to the Compact's Outer Settlements Authority 6 weeks prior for a retroactive corridor assignment expansion covering the Outer Kess transit nodes, on the grounds that the inspection work conducted at Station 9 had been in the administrative interest of the civil registry, and that the corridor assignment boundary ambiguity was a drafting artifact rather than an intentional jurisdictional restriction. The request had been granted 4 weeks prior. The confirmation letter from the Outer Settlements Authority was the second document, on official letterhead, signed by the regional coordinator, citing the same 9 precedent cases I had found. The third document was a 2-paragraph personal statement from Torren Saul, dated the previous week, notarized under the Outer Settlements Charter provision that allows registered civil operators of single-person stations to serve as notarization witnesses for documents pertaining to residents of their territory. A provision he had found, he noted at the top of the statement, while reading the code in response to the challenge. The statement said, in plain, direct language, that he had read the challenge and the relevant provisions, had identified the specific gap being used, and had taken the steps described in Documents 1 and 2 to close it. The second paragraph said, "I have found that the correct response to a documentation challenge is to improve the documentation until the challenge has nothing to attach to. I have done this. I would have preferred not to have needed to. I did what needed to be done. I will continue to do what needs to be done." I read it twice, then I looked at the child asleep on his shoulder. "When did you see the challenge?" I said. "The day it arrived," he said. "The corridor assignment request went out the same day. I wanted it in the record before the challenge's response window closed." He reached over and straightened the child's arm, which had fallen to an angle that would have been uncomfortable if the child had been awake to notice. I also contacted the Palace Records office because I knew they had an interest in the file being correct. I wanted them aware that the response was in process. "Who did you speak to?" "The head of domestic records, Morn." He picked up his pen again. He confirmed receipt. He said the standard was clear, he had applied it, and he thanked me for applying it on my end. Then he asked if the records office could assist with anything. I said the corridor assignment request was already in, and the notarized statement was being prepared, and I believed the challenge would fail. He said understood, and noted that he would record the communication in the file. He looked up. He was doing the same thing I was doing. "Building the record," I said. "Building the record," he agreed, "from both ends." The princess came in from the workshop at mid-morning, with the thermal coupling wrench still in her hand and a smear of compound on her forearm. She had been replacing the secondary antenna mount coupling, she said, because the vibration data from the previous storm cycle had shown micro-movement at the bracket interface that suggested the coupling was beginning to wear. She had checked the replacement schedule and found it was 3 weeks out, and decided to replace it now rather than wait, because doing it now in calm weather was simpler than doing it later in uncertain weather. She set the wrench on the table and looked at the folder. Then she looked at me. "Is it enough?" she said. "The corridor assignment expansion resolves the witnessing authority argument," I said. "The retroactive grant is clean and precedent supported. The challenge has no anchor." I paused. "I came to add an on-site supplementary statement to the file, which carries procedural weight that a written response alone does not. With the assignment expansion, the notarized statement, and my supplementary statement, the birth registration is documented from 4 separate administrative angles. The challenge cannot survive contact with all 4. She sat down across from me. She looked at the folder and she looked at the child on his shoulder and she said, with the level tone of someone stating a fact, "They're going to try again." "They may," I said. "Each successive challenge has to find a new gap. The documentation is now very thorough. The gaps are closing faster than they can find them, because the person doing the closing reads the code before filing and files correctly the first time." Something passed between the two of them, not a conversation, more the acknowledgement of a shared understanding between people who have spent 7 years reading the same silence and knowing what it meant. "I'm going to have to go soon," she said. "I know," he said. "Davin will go with me." "I know that. I'll come back. When things are settled there, I'll come back and he'll come here." She looked at the child. "He's going to want to come here when he's old enough to understand what this place is." "I'll keep it running for him," Torren Saul said, in the same flat tone he used for everything. As though keeping a relay station on the outer edge of the Kess corridor operational for the next 18 years, for the sake of a 4-month-old boy, was a straightforward operational commitment, which in his assessment it apparently was. I stayed for 3 days. On the second day I wrote the supplementary statement, 4 pages, carefully structured, citing the witnessing authority provision, the corridor assignment expansion, the 9 precedent cases, and my direct on-site confirmation of the child's registration and the parents' identities as the witnessing inspector. I noted that I had been present at the birth, had completed the registration at 600 on the day of delivery, had filed the digital copy personally from the station's comm system, and that the physical documentation was complete and in order as of that date. I notarized it with my official seal and made 3 copies, one for the case file, one for the relay post station records, and one to send to the Palace Records Office with a cover note addressed to Morn, Records Office, Veth Palace. On the 3rd day, I serviced the data connection on the post's comm unit, which had been running slow on the uplink. I had noticed it on the first day and had been thinking about it since. Torren Saul watched me work for 5 minutes and then handed me a different calibration tool than the one I was using. It was the correct tool for the connector I was adjusting. I accepted it without comment. The uplink ran at full speed afterward. In the evening of the 3rd day, after supper, the 3 of us sat at the table. The child was in the carry cloth on the princess's chest, a Vithrani piece, cream and copper threads, well made, the kind of cloth that takes time because the maker wanted it to last. She had made it herself. She had told me on the 2nd day, in the 3rd month of the pregnancy, working the threads by the lamp in the evenings after the maintenance work was done. She had learned the weave pattern from a Vithrani textile guide that had been in the post supply of secondary materials. A guide to traditional fiber work originally packed with the station's domestic supply kit, probably by whoever had stocked it years before either of them arrived. She had read it the way Torren Saul read everything, carefully, all the way through, until she knew what it required before she tried it. The child was awake, holding the edge of the cloth with both fists in the manner he apparently used for objects he was assessing seriously. He had been doing this since I had arrived for the second visit, picking up whatever was nearest and holding it with both hands and regarding it with a gravity entirely disproportionate to the object. He had done it with the maintenance pen, with the edge of the table, with a calibration tool that Torren Saul had moved out of his reach 3 times before accepting that the child was going to find it again. Each time, Torren had moved it gently and given him something else to hold, and each time the child had accepted the substitution, with the patience of someone who understood that certain negotiations required compromise. The gas giant Kesprimery was visible through the north window, the weather having cleared on the second afternoon and staying clear. It was, as I had been told, spectacular at this angle, a pale amber disk with a thin line of rings visible at the equatorial edge, large enough to fill the upper quarter of the window frame, close enough that on still nights you could see the texture of the upper atmosphere if you looked long enough. It cast a very faint warm light that mixed with the lamp on the table, and made the room feel like the inside of something cupped rather than the inside of something exposed, which I thought was an accurate description of what the post had been for 7 years. Torren Saul poured tea and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "When she goes, the documents will hold." "Yes," I said. "The birth record is clean. The registration is clean. The witnessing authority is now unambiguous. The personal statement is filed. The Palace Records Office has everything. The challenge is answered." "If there's a new challenge." "Then you read the code and find the provision and file the response correctly the first time," I said. "You have done it twice now. You know how it works." He looked at his tea. The child made a small sound and the princess adjusted her hold without looking down, the automatic correction of someone for whom that motion had been a reflex for 4 months and would be a reflex for the rest of her life. "The records man at the palace," he said. "Morn, he's going to keep the file open." "He's been keeping it open for 9 years, I said. "He declined 3 applications to presume death and redistribute the succession claim. He sent the applicable charter provisions to every council member as a transparency notice. He has been building the administrative record on that end the same way you have been building it on this end." I paused. "When she walks through the gate, there will be a file waiting for her that was never closed, and a record that makes it very difficult for anyone to argue that anything was other than exactly what it was." I looked at the folder on the table. The 2 records meet in the middle. "That is how it works." He nodded once slowly, with the quality of someone receiving confirmation of a calculation they had already run and whose result they had already accepted. He looked at the folder. He looked at the carry cloth. He looked at the north window and Kesprimery, and the very faint warm light it cast across the table. Then he looked at his son. The child was still holding the edge of the cloth with both fists, still regarding it with that absolute seriousness, and something in Torren Saul's face went very quiet and very complete. The same expression he had worn for 45 seconds at 3:17, the expression of a man reading a document that says exactly what he hoped it would say. He held it for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and opened the maintenance log, and made the evening's notations in the flat, unhurried hand of a man doing the work that was in front of him. I left on the 4th morning. The corridor weather had come back in overnight, not a full storm, but the high gray that preceded one, the sky the color of old metal, and the wind coming off the valley at an angle that meant the shuttle's departure window was specific. Torren Saul was already outside when I came out, checking the pad sensors and the approach sight lines with the methodical attention of a man who had been watching weather on this shelf for 11 years and knew what the approach window would be before the instruments confirmed it. He handed me the additional physical copy of the supplementary statement, sealed in an outer weather sleeve. "For your case file," he said. "Yours to keep." I have the copies in the shuttle, I said. Take this one too, he said. In case one of the others gets lost in transit. 3 copies is better than 2. He said it in the tone of someone who had thought about the failure modes and found that the cost of the extra copy was lower than the cost of needing it and not having it. I put it in my inner pocket. The princess walked out to the shuttle pad with me, carrying the child. The child was awake, looking at the gray sky with the same evaluative attention he brought to everything, as though the weather were a document worth reading. Thank you, she said, for the second trip. The documentation needed to be complete, I said. She looked at me directly. You came because you thought there might be trouble and you wanted to be here if there was. I did not argue with this because it was accurate. The record needed to be right, I said. The second visit made it right. It's the same thing, she said. What you said and what I said, they're the same thing. I thought about a relay operator who had read 7 sections of code until he knew what needed to be right before he could say everything was going to be right. I thought about a palace records man who had sent 4 pages to every counselor and called it standard practice and put a strip of copper tape on a drawer and left it there for 9 years. I thought about the lamp angle and the 2 hours and the 4 days of ache in my arm, and the fact that I had not said anything about it because there was nothing to say. Perhaps they are, I said. She shifted the child against her shoulder. He had his mother's amber eyes, open and still evaluating. He had his father's gravity, the particular quality of attention that does not perform itself, that simply is. He's going to want to come back here someday, she said. When he's older, he'll want to see where he's from. Kes Corridor Station 9, I said. It's in the record. Place of birth, she said. Yes. She said it without apology or qualification, in the flat, direct tone of someone who had been at this post for 7 years, and carried it in the way people carry places they have worked and learned in and meant something to. The relay post had been in her the same way it was in him, not as sentiment, but as practice. The daily recalibration, the reading of the code, the replacement of the coupling before the storm rather than after, the doing of what needed to be done because it needed doing and you were the person who could see it. I filed my route report on the return journey and noted the supplementary documentation visit under the standard inspection log heading. My office logged it without comment, which is what correct filings receive. Acknowledgement and nothing more, because nothing more is needed. 2 months later, a message arrived from the Palace Records Office. It said, "The supplementary documentation was received and filed. The challenge has been resolved. The file is complete and unimpeachable." The head of domestic records wishes to note that the on-site supplementary statement was the correct approach and that its procedural weight was decisive in the resolution. He thanks you for the second trip. I read it twice. Then I replied, the record needed to be complete. The second trip made it complete. I am glad it was useful. He replied 2 days later, it was more than useful, with a full stop. I have received a great many professional acknowledgments in 22 years of this work. Most of them are courteous and mean approximately what they say. This one meant more than it said, in the way that things written by precise people sometimes mean more than they say, and I have kept it in a small folder on my desk. 3 months after the message from Morn, I received a separate message from a compact civil registry notification address in the Veth Corridor network. It was an automated system message, the kind that fires when a case file is closed with a status of resolved, and all parties have been notified. It contained the case number of the birth registration. The 7-digit number I knew because I had watched Torren Saul file the flag the day after I left, and because the princess had recited it from memory in the interview, and it contained a single line of status text, registration confirmed final, all challenges resolved, no further action required. I noted it in my case records and filed it in the same folder as the message from Morn. The folder is thin. I do not put things in it lightly. What belongs there is documentation that proves a principle I try to maintain in this work, which is that the record, built carefully and maintained correctly, is the only thing that holds when everything else is trying to make it fail. This is what I mean when I say the second trip was the job. The job is not the form and the signature and the digital confirmation and the sealed bark leather case. The job is the thing the form and the signature and the case are for, which is that when someone needs to say, "This is true, and it has always been true, and here is the proof in the form that cannot be argued with, the proof exists." The proof is there because someone put it there correctly and kept it there, and went back to make it more complete when someone tried to find a gap in it. The work is for making the record right, so that when someone needs it to hold, it holds. It means that a woman can walk into a palace anteroom carrying a 4-month-old child and ask a records man if her file is still open and hear the answer yes, and have that yes be unassailable, not because one person kept a file and another person held a lamp and a third person read the code all night, but because all three did, and the three records met in the middle, and the middle held. It held because two men read the code carefully and did not stop reading until they knew what needed to be right. It held because one inspector made 2 journeys of 4 days each. It held because a queen kept an unofficial channel open in year 6 and trusted that the file would be there when her daughter came back to it. It held because a records man put copper tape on a drawer and did not take it off for 9 years, and every morning for 9 years the first thing he saw when he came to his desk was the drawer, and the drawer said, "Still here." The records hold when the people responsible for them do not stop. That is the whole principle. It is not complicated. It simply requires that you do not stop, which is harder than it sounds across 9 years, and across 9 days of corridor travel in a shuttle with a heater that works on alternate hours, and in the early hours of a Thursday morning, when the lamp needs to be at a precise angle, and your arm is going to ache for 4 days, and you do not say anything about it because holding the lamp correctly is not something that requires comment. It requires comment only when it was not done, and it was done, so it does not. I held the lamp, he read the code, the records man kept the drawer marked. The record held. I consider that the job.